Well, hello and welcome to the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. It is Thursday, March 13th, and I am Guy Stevens, the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Excited to have you here today. We've got another great conversation in store, and I think one that will be really important. Those of you that may not be familiar with who we are and what we do, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was formed just about 6 years ago. In fact, March marks 6 years. So we were formed about 6 years ago. Started the Alliance after a personal experience. Have a neurodivergent son who was restrained, secluded, and traumatized. Got me asking a lot of questions, trying to figure out what we could do differently. Never at the time planning to start a nonprofit or leaving my career, but ultimately kind of took a deep dive into this and realized that there were things that we could do that were better not just for kids, but also teachers, staff, families, communities, and that's what this work is really all about. So in that vein, really excited to have our guest with us today, who I will introduce here in just a few minutes. But we've got Dr. Mike Leichliter here with us today, and what's really interesting, this is going to be a conversation with a school superintendent that did some, I think, really meaningful work related to restraint and seclusion. And as you all know, part of our mission here is, how do we influence change? And I think bringing people on that have had journeys and done things that have made positive differences is really important. So at any rate, we'll get to that in just a moment here. Before we do, a couple things that I wanted to share with you. One, I wanted to thank one of our podcast sponsors, and many of you are familiar with Supportable Solutions. They've been a sponsor of ours for going on 2 years for our podcast. Supportable Solutions, of course, is a company that's run by a friend and colleague, Connie Persick. Connie does a lot of work in educational consulting and has developed something called the Why Toolkit. And the Why Toolkit is really a way to get at the deeper why beneath behavior. Many of you have heard of things like functional behavioral assessments, and the Why Toolkit is something that's very aligned with all the work that we do here. It's aligned with kind of those 5 principles, and let me share with you a little information about it here.
Behaviors are signals to the deeper whys. The Why Toolkit, a tool built for and approved by teachers, parents, and administrators that can both assess and support individuals struggling with behaviors. Connie has created a document that turns typical behavioral documents upside down and replaces them with a deep dive into what really matters: how to support each child within a compassionate and relational framework based on their individual differences. The Why Toolkit was found to decrease seclusion and restraint by 21% in a year-long pilot study.
And we thank Supportable Solutions for their support and being a sponsor for our podcast. And as you saw there, doing things like using the Why Toolkit, they can help us to reduce and eliminate practices like restraint and seclusion. We're in a great opportunity today to learn from Dr. Mike about some of the things that they've done to reduce the use of restraint and seclusion as well. So stay tuned. One other quick announcement before I introduce our guest. I just wanted to share with you, many of you know, we are, of course, a very small nonprofit, although we are kind of national in reach here. We're a small organization. We're a small organization trying to influence change, not only here in the United States, but elsewhere. And we've done a lot of work to try to support that. Our focus is on education, it's on legislation, it's on individual support. But as a small nonprofit, you may imagine, sometimes it's difficult. It's difficult for us to find funding to do the things that are really important to us, to be able to support families, to be able to create programs and do things to make a difference. And I'm always encouraging people, if you're interested in the work we're doing, think about joining us. We have an option now to join the Alliance. And if you go to our website, which is endseclusion.org, there's an option to join. By joining us, you can kind of help support our mission, and you can do that in a number of ways. We have an option, of course, to join us as a supporter, and what we're looking for is people that this work resonates with and are willing to, make a small contribution. And a monthly contribution of even $5 a month makes a difference and helps us to do the work that we're doing. But a number of options there, even volunteer options as well. I encourage you to check it out. So check out our website if you're able to. We really appreciate the support because, without help, without support, it's hard to do this. And so at any rate, thank you for considering that. And let's get to why you're really here, because it's not just that you're here to hear me talk. You've heard me talk enough. I want to introduce to you somebody that is a colleague, and Mike, if you don't mind, I'm gonna even say a friend, because I feel like we've known each other for a while, and I have a lot of respect for you, and I've gotten to get to know you over a period of years as well. Let me read your bio here to give people an idea of who you are, but we're really excited to have you here. And of course, you are a superintendent, and you've been doing some amazing work. So Mike is passionate about the ability of public education to provide all students with high quality education, and is proud to be the superintendent of the Harwood Unified Union School District in Vermont. And Mike's goal is to improve classroom experience for students and teachers, and be a champion in the community for public education. And that's something I think is so important. I often say, like, we can improve outcomes for not just kids, but also the teachers and the staff, and the impact that can have on the community can be so great. Started your career in 1991 as a middle school and high school social studies teacher in the city of York, Pennsylvania, and following experiences as a high school assistant principal, middle school principal, and assistant superintendent for personnel. He was named as superintendent of schools for the Penn Manor School District in 2009, school system serving 5,400 students in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. After finishing your educational career in Pennsylvania, you were drawn to the Harwood Unified Union School District in central Vermont through your travels in the state, and that is a beautiful area. I've not been there much, but I had an opportunity several years ago to kind of go up through Vermont and New Hampshire, and so beautiful. And particularly during the time that your daughter attended the University of Vermont. You are a member of the Vermont Superintendents Association, and currently serve as its representative on a statewide commission on the future of public education in Vermont. You are somebody that enjoys the opportunity to learn, discover, and help Harwood make progress. The school's desire for its students and communities, and just really appreciate all that you do. And of course, I got to know you through some things that were happening there in your school district, and we've gotten to collaborate, I guess, a bit on the things that you were working through in your school district. And at one point, we even put a proposal in to speak at a conference together. Unfortunately, that didn't come through, but I'm always eager to collaborate with people doing this work. So Mike, thank you for being here, and we're really excited to have you here, and to kind of share some of the journey that you've been on. So thank you.
Thank you, Guy. And I feel the same way. I feel like we've developed a relationship in 2.5 years that I consider you as a friend as well as a colleague. So
I need to come visit you in Vermont soon, because
absolutely.
It's a beautiful area. I do want to let people know, if you're watching live, and I know we've got a number of people that are watching live, let us know in the chat who you are and where you're from. It's always fun to see where people are joining us from, and who's on. We tend to get a lot of people that kind of episode after episode are here with us, and it's always great to see the familiar names. We also, believe it or not, we get people from all over the world. So when we do these events, we get people from Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and it's always fun to see where people are. In fact, we have people so often that I know the time zones a little bit, and I'm like, oh, okay, like it's 7:30 something in the morning in Australia, so it's already tomorrow there. So anyway, if you're here with us live, let us know in the chat who you are and where you're from. Would love to know who's joining us here today. So Mike, we're gonna have a conversation, but I just want to kind of start with how we kind of became connected, and I want to talk about kind of your work, your journey, the things that you've been doing really over the couple of years that we've known each other. But of course, you have a career that spans far longer than that, which has certainly probably influenced the work that you've done. But I guess we got to know each other because going back a few years ago, there were concerns being raised, and in fact, I was trying to think about how Harwood first kind of got on my radar, and I think there was a board meeting that the issue of prone restraint and seclusion was being raised, and this was actually before you had started with the district. I think there was a current superintendent who I think at that time was planning to leave, and you hadn't started yet, as I recall. But there was some discussion about prone restraint and seclusion, and that got on my radar, and educator in the area that I connected with at some point as well. But there were some concerns being raised in the community. So My recollection, and you're going to help me with dates here, but I want to say that was around a May timeframe, and I think you started a few months later, if I recall, in the district. So, and this is always fun, right? You're coming into a new position, and there's something brewing that is going to be something you're going to need to work with. How did you first become aware, as you were coming into Harwood? How did you first become aware that the issue of seclusion and restraint was kind of on the radar there?
Well, Guy, I don't think we ever talked about this level of detail, but I'll give you a little background because it's actually an interesting story. I decided that I was retiring from Pennsylvania, and we wanted to move to Vermont in the fall of 2021. So I researched schools. I researched other jobs too, consulting jobs, jobs with state agency, with some nonprofits, university, and I decided I wanted to stay a superintendent because I believe in the work we do. So I interviewed in Harwood starting early January. I was hired in February to begin July 1st, 2022. So after that point in time, I started watching board meetings, as a good superintendent does, just to understand the culture. And I was literally in my family room in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, watching the April, and I can't remember the date, but it was April 2022, watching the board meeting. And at the beginning, there were citizen comments, and the educator you referenced, community member, spoke up and said he was concerned with the total number of restraints, use of seclusion, and particularly prone restraints in the district, and cited numbers for previous years that in some cases exceeded 300 a year. Now, this for some other context, the school district where I am now has 1,700 students, K through 12. We also have pre-kindergarten, so when you include those students in, it's about 1,850. The district I was coming from was in a geographically smaller area, but had a population 3 times the size. So I was very familiar with restraint and seclusion. I worked with the special education director in Lancaster, who had a strong belief that we needed to reduce those numbers starting around 2011, when the U.S. Department of Education, and I think I'm right on that year, when they started highlighting some of the concerns nationwide. So we had done work in my previous district on restraint, but I think a key point was in Pennsylvania, prone supine restraint is not permitted in public schools. So when this community member brought that point up, I about fell off my chair that prone restraints were something that were permitted, because Vermont's a very progressive state. It really surprised me, and the numbers also surprised me. So I texted my current special ed director and said, "What can you tell me about prone restraint still being permitted?" It was something that I was not connected with. So that's how I learned about it. I contacted the superintendent at the time to discuss that issue. And at that point in time, I knew that in essence, the early honeymoon was over, because there was some really serious work to be done.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I often, when I think about restraint and seclusion, there are a lot of, and in fact, even at a higher level, as you talk about being a superintendent, one of the things I think is having attended a number of board meetings, in not only my home district, but across the country virtually as well. I always think to myself, wow, being a superintendent is a really tough job. There are a lot of people coming to you with a lot of concerns about a lot of issues. I've often thought to myself, even the Board of Education, I mean, that can be a really tough place to be as well. But nonetheless, I mean, when you think about policies, and certainly that's a big part of what a board does, looks at policies, looks at budget, things like that. When you think about policies, there are very few policies in a school that can result in death, right? There are very few policies that, if things aren't going well, that can have such a major impact. So, I always think about restraint and seclusion in this context. It's a really serious issue. And when people begin talking about it, if issues like this come up, there's a lot of, obviously there's a lot of concern, a lot of passion, and a lot of push, to bring about change. And it's funny, as you were walking through that, I was remembering one of the first times you and I talked, and kind of both had the same response. As you probably know, I mean, there are many states around the country that have prohibited the use of prone restraint. And this is not universal. We don't have federal law here, but I was actually very surprised that Vermont was not one of those states that had already banned prone restraint at the time. I want to say it was like 37 states had. So I wouldn't have suspected that Vermont would have been on that list. But of course, California at the time was on that list as well.
Right.
So sometimes these things do surprise you. So at any rate, you're coming in. This issue has arisen. It's interesting. You were talking about kind of going back because it was 2009 that the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, put out one of their really big reports, which was a evaluation and look at restraint and seclusion. And that report that was titled "Seclusion and Restraint: Selected Instances of Death and Abuse in Public and Private Schools and Treatment Centers." That report really began a lot of dialogue around this. And in fact, there was an initial effort to pass federal law following that report. That report highlighted hundreds of instances of potential death and abuse due to the use of seclusion and restraint. And it was a couple years later, I think, they tried in 2009 to get a piece of federal law moving forward. It made some progress and then stopped, as these things sometimes do. And I think in 2012, then the Department of Education began putting out more guidance around restraint and seclusion. And I think part of the thought was, and I don't want to speak for the people in that room, although we've had an opportunity to meet with some of them at one point. But I think it was guidance, and it was guidance intended to maybe help states think about how to look at these things. So they came up with their 15 principles, talking about how these things should be only used in certain situations. And in fact, they even in that early document had talked about prone and supine restraint and talked about, restraints that could potentially affect breathing and recommended against using those. And what happened at that point is that states slowly began, updating policies and bringing in new laws, but it happened very unevenly and it didn't happen everywhere. I mean, there were some states that were very slow. So, there's absolutely a lot of history there. So I can imagine, kind of that initial coming onto your radar, following, the GAO report. And there were some news. In fact, Connecticut, I mean, there were a number of serious stories that came out of Connecticut regarding things like restraint and seclusion. So here you are, getting ready to go into a new district, already knowing there's going to be some things that are going to be on your plate in terms of policies and issues to look at, and of course it's a big one. It's one that I think is really significant. So as you came in and you kind of had a little bit of background, I know there was some thought, and I remember watching some board meetings, but it's been so long that your memory is probably far better than mine. But there were some board meetings and discussions about kind of what to do about it. About, as I recall, was there a committee or something that might have been formed as well? Tell us a little bit about the beginning of this.
Sure. Well, at the time in April, when I mentioned speaking to my at that time current special ed director, when I said, well, it's permitted in Vermont and they use it in the district where I'm going, her immediate comment, without missing a beat, was, "Mike, you got to stop it. You can't continue with prone restraint. That's just unheard of." And this is only a year and a half after the George Floyd killing. So this was very much in my mind at the time. And I knew the dangers of prone restraint. So I started in July. I met with the person who brought the concerns forward, very, very brave on his part to speak out. And at that point, he was working in the school district. So I spoke with him, met with him. I met with principals. I met with people in the community. In Vermont, we have a citizen legislature, so it's a part-time legislature. And there was a particular school that was of concern for their numbers, and she was the representative for that community. I met with her. She had a background in mental health. So I just gathered a lot of information. I had a very supportive school board who this was a very serious concern to them as well. And after processing this through, after meeting with our school's attorney, I approached the board chair and vice chair and said, I think we need to put a moratorium on the use of prone restraint. So we did that in August. If you do a Google search on myself and Harwood and you'll probably find that if someone wants to reach out through you, Guy, I'm happy to give them some more information on this. But we instituted that. But I also knew we needed more work and training because teachers want to do the right thing. This was not a fault on the part of the teachers. And what also made this somewhat of an unusual circumstance is rather than totally relying on our own staff for support for students who may have had needs that required a higher level of intensity, we have a unique relationship where we would contract, and still do in some cases, with outside mental health agencies. So in this case, the county mental health agency. And one of the other issues that I've learned is that that agency used one program, Handle with Care, and our school district used CPI training. So there was this piece and kind of the struggle with who's responsible when there's a high need of a student who may need either de-escalation or, in the worst case scenario, some level of restraint. So that was one of those other pieces too. But again, being a small state, the state where I am now, Vermont, has 650,000 residents, which was about the size of just the county that I used to live in. We don't have the same level of educational resources and supports that a larger area does, because of our rurality and some of those other challenges. So I reached out to a person that I had worked with, who worked for our intermediate unit. Some states call them BOCES, but she was a behavior support specialist, did a number of jobs, was one of the best professionals I ever worked with. Her name is Diane Carrera. And she happened to, at that time, have retired and moved to Massachusetts. She's worked in various states, including in Vermont, earlier in her career. So the board supported me in contracting with her to consult, but also do trainings with our staff to improve the level of services and to reduce our use of restraint overall.
Mm-hmm. So you initially, not long after getting there and kind of getting a good assessment, probably with the words of your previous colleague in your mind as well, you pretty quickly put this idea of, okay, we're going to stop doing prone restraint right now, and put that moratorium in effect. Did you get at that point a lot of concern or pushback around this? One of the things that we often see, and of course, you were taking some action, but of course, there's a bigger policy question that has to work its way through as well. And I actually really appreciate that you took that action, not just kind of waiting for all of this to kind of work forward, but often when these changes are proposed, there's a lot of concern and pushback, and people say, well, if we don't have that in our toolbox, or we can't do that, X will happen, or we'll have to send kids to more restrictive settings, all these things. So talk to me a little bit about that. As you first put that moratorium in effect, were you hearing concerns and pushback? And again, some may be very valid concerns, right?
Right.
There's concerns about, we hear things about staffing. Now, of course, that shouldn't be a reason that we're restraining kids, but nonetheless, some of these concerns can be really valid and important in influencing what people think. What was your experience in that kind of early phase of things?
There was concern, and it really wasn't about controlling kids or other things that you may think would come up, but it was really about, we're talking about a systemic change. We're talking about changing a mindset, and how do we do that very quickly without having the supports and training in place. So that's why we moved pretty quickly on reaching out with Diane. We had some people internally who could also do some of that training. I started alongside of John Berliner, who's now our special ed director. He came in at the same point. And interestingly enough, and I'm not sharing anything out of turn, he shared this publicly in a public meeting, but he was a behavior interventionist before he was a special education teacher, and was in the situation where he had to perform restraints on students, and had his own trauma experiences and physical challenges as a result of that. He was injured. So he was coming into it with, we need to do something different as well. So he had those boots on the ground type of experiences and credibility of having lived through a circumstance where he knew that restraint needed to be reduced in our district. And I also want to point out, in the previous year before I came, when this was brought to light, I think there were about 5 prone restraints. So that was part of the piece. But a larger part of the piece is what I consider to be the overuse of other types of restraint in our school. So it was almost a two-pronged approach. And then there was also the concern with seclusions. And that's something else that we could talk about later. But there were multiple pieces to the puzzle. I think we allayed those concerns just because of experiences, and because also there was one school that was brought to light, and those teachers want to be doing the right thing.
Right.
So they knew that they instinctively knew that they needed to do things differently. And I also think it's important to note that the teachers in most of the cases were not the ones who were performing the restraints. It was the outside agency. So part of that piece was, how do we collaborate with an outside agency to improve those numbers as well? And how do we put in essentially de-escalation training so that we can work with the students where they are at the time without moving to that most restrictive form of intervention.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned a couple things there that really kind of jumped out at me. I mean, in one, talking about John's, experience, and this is something we talk about a lot. I mean, first of all, nobody becomes an educator because they want to restrain or seclude a kid, right? That's we're talking about a profession where people become educators because they want to help kids. Not to say there's never any chance of a bad player out there, but by and large, when we're talking about educators, nobody wants to do that. And the other thing that you said was that these things really are traumatic for the staff. There is nothing at all pleasant about being in a position where you think you need to use a physical restraint, and you use a physical restraint. That can be a situation where staff are more likely to get injured, but that trauma can be very real for the staff member as well. And one of the things that we talk about quite a bit is kind of what I call kind of the trauma cycle that can happen related to physical restraint and seclusion. And that is that, we already know that the people that are more likely to find themselves being restrained and secluded often already have a trauma background. These are often, neurodivergent kids with disabilities, kids that may have experienced, other types of trauma. And we know that trauma, changes the brain. We know that trauma, leads to individuals that are more likely to be hypervigilant, more likely to have kind of stress-related behaviors. And very often we see this cycle where, when these things are being done to kids, they're further traumatizing them, further leading to more behavior, not less behavior. But we see that trauma cycle also holds true with staff. Like, and I don't know if you've had experiences like this. I mean, we don't have to dig into specifics, but where sometimes a staff member that might be doing these things more, they continue to do them more because they don't feel safe. And when a staff member doesn't feel safe, they're more likely to go into a hands-on intervention, perhaps before that should really happen. And that cycle just kind of feeds itself. And there are cases that we see, things like this that happen around the country where you'll find it repeatedly happening to a kid. And, of course, the Office of Civil Rights has kind of weighed in on that and said, like, if you're doing this repeatedly, it's a failure. We need to figure out what's going on and how to meet those children's needs. But, the truth of the matter is these things really are traumatic. And, again, it's not just one side that's traumatic on kids, but it's traumatic for staff as well. So anything we can do to reduce, is certainly work worth doing. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Well, and that's that's what we found, that once you move to that approach, unless you have really good procedures in place, really good evaluation, and then support in looking at what the needs of the child are, and how you have to adjust your approach, that you'll continue to go down. And that's the data we looked at. With the explaining this to the public was very difficult because they had the thinking that we had teachers just restraining students. But when we looked at the total number, it was pretty shocking. In fact, I was just looking, am I able to present? Because what I did.
You should be able to. If you go down to the present option down in the middle, you'll have a couple options. And what you can choose is share screen. And if you choose share screen, it might pop up a thing to ask you for permission. And if it does, tell it yes. And then it should give you a screen that says screen sharing works best with multiple screens. If you hit OK, it should show you an option of things you can share. And if you click on one of those and hit share, hopefully we'll see it.
Okay. So what I am sharing.
Okay, perfect.
With
you, and I just, okay, I'm going to bring it up now and share it. Okay, perfect. Yep. Okay.
I had, so any, in Vermont, restraint seclusion is covered by Rule 4500, which defines what we can and can't do and what the reporting is. So I review now every single restraint that occurs. And this is just a history from the beginning of the school year through today of our use of restraint and seclusion, and then the number of students involved. So what was striking to me, and back in the 2021-2022 school year, which is when this was first brought up, I think at the end of the year, the total use of restraint was somewhere in the neighborhood of 130 restraints that year. But what this shows me is that we have about the same number of students who have those concerns. But to your point you made, during this time period in the 2021-2022 school year, there were 7 students with 86 restraints.
Wow.
And so something's not working.
Right.
Our numbers came down as a result of the work we've done. We're still looking at about the same number of students. I think even this year, 11's too high, but I am far more. I am less alarmed with that number than I was looking at 7 students with 86 restraints total.
Right. Yeah, and that's significant progress. Yeah, absolutely. So let me back up for a second. And, at some point we went from kind of your initial prohibition on prone restraint, but it got broader than that. And you were looking to eliminate the use of seclusion as well. Tell me a little bit more about how kind of that came to be, how things began to shift from just this concern around prone restraint, but also, seclusion and reducing restraint overall. What were the catalysts for that?
So for the seclusion piece, it's something I had no experience with. Seclusion was not permitted. We did not use it in my previous school. What complicated it in Vermont is just to remind everyone that the time period we're discussing occurred during COVID. So there was guidance from the Vermont Agency of Education, which oversees the process, saying that in cases where restraint may be needed, seclusion was the preferred option, which doesn't necessarily make sense to me. I understand what
that guidance was really concerning when it came out. Well, and for a lot of reasons, because seclusion is involuntary confinement, right? How do you get someone to a seclusion room involuntarily? You restrain them. I mean, that's what happens in practice. Kids are restrained and then put into seclusion first. It's not an either or. It's often a both. But even to say one is preferable to the other, we've actually had even entire state agencies that have somehow come to believe that like seclusion is, it's better. It's better to put a kid in seclusion than to restrain them. Yeah. Anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that when that came out, I just almost blew a head gasket. I was like, what are they saying?
This didn't make sense to me.
Right.
I can, in a kind of strange way, I can understand where the logic came from.
Right.
But in a practical educational manner, it's nonsensical.
Yeah. And for our sake, we had, kind of gotten some awareness of what was going on with the situation there, and the educator you mentioned, Brian Delamura, who has actually written a couple articles for us as well. Brian had reached out to me and we had a couple conversations, and we published a couple pieces as well, and kind of from at that point, kind of from the outside perspective, like, Harwood, you should do something about this. You should eliminate seclusion, eliminate prone restraint. But at some point, you and I connected, and I'm not even remembering the exact circumstances, but you and I connected for a phone call, and had a couple opportunities to chat, and I was really just pleased that you were willing to take a few minutes and chat with me, because sometimes you might be in a position of a superintendent go, this person from the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint wants to talk to me, but you were willing to have a conversation, a really honest conversation, and that kind of started the relationship that we had. Do you recall kind of some of that initial?
I do.
Okay.
And that was also at a time where we were looking for anyone who could help us.
Right.
And I think I did some research, very brief research, before I called you back. I think we're all looking at solution-oriented approaches. And that's what's important. And I think, you are about not the gotcha, but the how do we make
Right.
this better for kids?
That's right. That's right. So the focus begins to also include that overall idea of reducing restraint and eliminating seclusion. And so where does that go with the board? So the board begins some discussion about this, and I know there were some meetings that this was a topic of discussion. Where do things go with the board? And I remember actually, kind of having some involvement, talking to you when that situation was really active, but talk us through that a little bit, if you would, of kind of what came next.
Sure. And we live in a very progressive community. So I had a board who felt we needed to do something and we needed to do something yesterday. So I had a lot of support and I had resources to be able to work with our staff and make those changes. And the board also really wanted to look at the policy. We used the model policy from the state.
Yep.
And the board felt very strongly that they wanted to just outright eliminate the use of prone supine restraint and seclusion. And that's also what led to my decision for a moratorium, because what I said to them is, there's a lot of things to unwrap in this puzzle, and we know it's not the right thing to do. But before we enact a board policy, a formal policy which has implications, legal implications, let's move to the route of putting a moratorium on this, and then let's study this so you fully understand what the implications are, what the potential risks could be. Even though I think educationally, morally, legally that we needed to stop doing it. If you're in a state that says yes, you can, and you're working with partners that have different methods, you have to understand what those risks are, because we live in a society where it's best to be informed on what you're going to do moving forward because of those legal ramifications.
Mm-hmm.
So the board put together a committee, and we had some really good board members. In fact, there was one new board member and one fairly new board member who joined the committee, who are now our board chair and vice chair. And I think part of the reason our board eventually elected them in those positions is because they provided a lot of strong leadership for our board at the time. So we spent time, we examined the data, we shared the data of what we found from previous years, and that's something else we could talk about, some of the challenges with that data. We also talked to various experts. We had advice from legal counsel, and really looked at the policy for the first couple of months. And my memory is not entirely clear on exactly when we started writing the new policy, but I think it was around the January timeframe. So they started working on that new policy, sharing it with the board, and then adopted the policy in May, which effective immediately eliminated the use of restraint seclusion. I'm sorry, eliminated the use of prone supine restraint, and put an end date on seclusion, which was at the end of the following year. And there were some various reasons for that and some advice that the board received. I'm happy to say that even though there was some criticism of keeping that seclusion piece open a little longer, we were still committed to not using seclusion, and in fact did not have any instances where we had a case of seclusion under Rule 4500 for that school year.
Yeah. And you and I talked a bit about that as well. And we were very supportive of what you were doing, and understood that need to sunset. And of course, at the end of the day, as you said, you ended up not even doing it at all in that year. And I absolutely understand the desire, like, let's get rid of this right now. But I think ultimately the board crafted a policy that was significant. And I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about it, I sometimes use you as an example, and it's in a positive way. But I talk about the fact that, people often will fall back on, well, this is what our state says, so this is what we have to do. And I always kind of come back to, and of course there are attorneys that will say that as well. I come back to the state is setting the floor here. You have to meet these standards. But if you are going to exceed these standards, if they say you can do this, but you decide that you're not going to do this, absolutely, that is a possibility. But there's often that idea that you can't do that you can't have something that's different. And we're seeing it more and more. In fact, in Virginia, just about 2 weeks ago, another district in Virginia, passed the prohibition on the use of seclusion. It is allowed at the state level. They're not the first one in Virginia to do that. But I think that's important. And I'm sure that, and in fact, I have some recollection of that being a little bit of a challenge for you. What would your advice be to superintendents that might be in a similar position thinking about this?
My advice is to do your research, but in the end, to go with what you think is best educationally. And in that case, I think the research is pretty clear on what's best educationally. There's various reasons in Vermont, and you were involved in some of this. Our state representative, Teresa Wood, who I mentioned, introduced legislation to ban prone restraint. And unfortunately, that did not make it out of committee. But I still think in the end, we know that that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. At the beginning of this year, kind of, I guess, on his way out, Secretary of Education Cardona put out some guidance around restraint and seclusion, and really, took a deep dive into, kind of the impact and the trauma, and it was, I think the strongest guidance to date that we've gotten from that level. And again, I agree with you. I mean, just because you can doesn't mean you should, and it may be a little bit more difficult. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically. You mentioned Diane earlier, and Diane's somebody that I've had the privilege of getting to know as well, and have actually interviewed Diane, and she wrote a book called The Reset Process. Has done a lot of fantastic work kind of in the trauma-informed and neuroscience kind of a behavior space. Can you talk to me a little bit more? You mentioned earlier kind of, reaching out and Diane coming into the district, but talk to me a little bit more about that work, what it looked like. And again, change is difficult. So, as you're bringing in, and this is a really important thing that I think that you did that probably goes to a lot of success. You can't just say, don't do these things. You've got to say, and here are things that we can do instead, and here's a different way of doing things. So can you tell me a little bit more about the work that Diane did and what she brought into the district and how that was received?
Well, we brought Diane immediately, but we also, our district, we have an early November full day staff development for pre-K to 12 teachers. So one of the pieces that we wanted to lay out was the why. So why is this important work? And why do we need to re-examine our practices? And Diane did a really good job bringing that trauma-informed lens of the harm it does to children long-term, and went through a really good presentation for kindergarten teachers, teachers of special ed, high school English teachers, phys ed teachers, of the whole process. And I also have learned from being a superintendent that no matter who you put in front of a professional development session, they, number one, have to have credibility. And they also have to understand what it's like to be in the classroom and some of the challenges. And Diane met all those criteria. And she's just a very warm and caring person, very passionate person, but also extremely knowledgeable. I worked with her when I first connected with Diane when I was a middle school principal, and she worked with us when we had a student, probably one of the most challenging students in my 34-year career at this point. And she came in and brought insights to our team, child-centered insights that really transformed how we worked with that student. So she didn't come in and tell us what we had to do. She just came in with the approach of, here's what I'm going to share with you. Here's some other things to consider, and let's talk about this as a team. And that's how she did this with a large group. So we had a large group session, which, as any teacher who's watching or anyone who's been in the classroom knows, that one person talking in front of, however, 100, 200, 300 faculty members is not always the best approach.
Right.
So we paired that then with some smaller workshops in the afternoon that really targeted the audience. And then we brought her back into the school that had particular concerns. And she focused that conversation, number one, with a smaller group who really worked with our students, our students who had needs that may result in restraint. And then she worked with the larger faculty on the reset process and different pieces in her reset process, which is research-based, that they could implement immediately. And then we've brought her back in a number of times with that group and then some other smaller groups to take a look at what's the next step. What questions do you have? How do you take this information and make it applicable to the students you're working with right now? So that was a piece. We also brought her into our other schools that may not have been experiencing the same level of difficulty, but how can we look at what we're doing in those settings differently to really focus on student need. And I think the fact that we were also at the kind of the tail end of COVID and some of the challenges that all students were experiencing, there was transferable skills to other pieces. And she made that very clear and she gave very practical pieces of advice for classroom teachers. And she said, you may not ever have a need for restraint, but you do have the need to work with students who have challenges, who may actually benefit from some of the strategies we're using, de-escalation strategies. So she gave very practical tips, very practical advice, and we still continue to have a relationship with her. One of the other pieces that grew out of this, again, because we are a small state, we don't have the same level of resources, professional resources in our schools. And we're in a state where we really try to emphasize keeping students in their home school, mainstreamed with other students. Sometimes I found there's a reluctance to say, we really need to consider a different kind of placement for the student. So we worked on a program that we have at one of our elementary schools now, which is that next level. When you're looking at the least restrictive environment, if a student needs that next level of support, a smaller, more inclusive classroom, then this is the kind of program we call it Rivers, which, if you think of the thought of a flowing river and kind of the velocity and how it moves and how it changes, that's kind of why we chose the name, because you have to meet the different needs of students. But she helped establish that program. We have an excellent teacher that we hired who has some experiences with students with histories of trauma, neurodivergent students who need a little extra support. So we've established that and have made some really good progress with that program this year. One of our first bits of advice is be very specific in your first year. Do not exceed a handful of students. Do not exceed 3 or 4 students in that classroom until you establish that program and make it successful. So we have, I think we've had some success with that program, and we hope to, again, we don't want to expand it in terms of numbers, but we want to expand it in terms of quality and how it serves the students that may have that higher level of need. So she's been involved with that process as well. So I think it's been multifaceted depending on the need, but I think we've tried to bring a different lens to the work we're doing with students.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I shared a link to Diane's book here in the chat as well. Kind of thinking back to that change again, I've often said, and not to say that this is the the rule here, but I mean, change is hard, and it can take a few years to kind of go from the beginning of something to really getting to where you want to be. And even looking at your data, it's like there's a progression, right? And you're looking at the data, and it's so far better than where it started. But as I heard from you, like, we still want it to be better, right? But that process of change can be really difficult. And of course, bringing in Diane, having training, certainly a good step. But anytime you propose changes, there are some people that are ready to jump on board, some people that are resistant, and a lot of people that kind of wait to see how things are heading and where things are going. Having a training again, great step. Were there other things that you did to kind of get people on board and to I mean, even feeling heard, I guess, is important for people is they're, kind of looking at things that are going to change. And it can be a frightening time. I mean, I have worked with districts that have, for instance, come under investigation for their use of restraint and seclusion. And suddenly, they know changes are coming. They don't know what, and even as things get in the news, you might be an educator trying to support kids, but suddenly feel like, oh gosh, like people think that we're terrible people or that we're harming people. What other things did you do to try to, one, reassure educators and help bring them on board to get them, kind of really moving in this direction of change?
I just also think that support is a piece of that. We really tried to, kind of like you did with us, that this is not about a gotcha. This is about a what do you need, and
Right.
how can we be supportive. And I think once teachers understood that we were looking to support, especially coming out of a very difficult time for education in general,
Yeah.
I think there was a greater comfort that we're not looking to discipline, punish, hurt adults or kids. We're looking
Right.
to say, what are those pieces that we don't have in place? What do we need to do? And what resources do we need to provide for you?
Right. Right.
And I
Yeah.
think that's been a big that was a big piece of people accepting that change, and also being a part of that is also an important part.
Mhm. Yeah, it brings me back to the quote that's in almost every presentation I ever give, which is the Maya Angelou quote, right? It's the "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." None of this is about judging, but it's about, are there opportunities to know better? Can we do better? And I think when it comes to, supporting children, it shouldn't only be aspirational. I mean, we really should be driven by that. Let's do better. And ultimately, I mean, again, I'm a big proponent of the fact that I think that, and I'm going to ask you a question in this vein in a second, but I think that the same things that you can do to improve the outcomes for kids very often can result in better outcomes for everybody. And it can be hard to see when you feel like you're in the middle of a fire and things are really difficult. But ultimately, I think there's a lot of benefit to doing the things that you've done here.
Well, I think back to my first year as a teacher, and what I did as a first year teacher, just because I didn't know,
Right.
I didn't have the experience, I didn't have the training, and I think every year that we're in the profession, we try to be better at what we do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we make a bigger jump than in other years, but I think we're always trying to do something better the next year.
Yeah, no, I hear you. So let's talk about a few years out from when this all started, and knowing that again, it's all about kind of continuing to strive to do better. And I know you've been involved kind of at state level, talks here as well. But can you talk to me a little bit about what are some of the benefits that you've seen? So kind of coming out of this and bringing in the training that you brought in and making some changes to help support this work. What are some of the benefits that you've seen in terms of, the staff, in terms of, the school, the students, the leadership? Could you tell me a little bit about kind of what positive things have come out of this?
Well, and some of this is just from talking to teachers and principals in schools that were more heavily impacted. Uh, just the overall climate, I'm told, has changed. I do not have the benefit of having seen that during the periods of higher use of restraint, but I can say that from what I'm told, there's a more relaxed and confident feel in one building in particular. But just other pieces, I would say, we still rely on outside agencies, not to the same degree, and we've tried to pull that back. But again, we're in a kind of an under-resourced area, and I think our relationships have improved, and our training and our collaboration has improved as a result of that. We have much clearer definitions of who should be taking the lead in certain situations. I think a lot of times, if you don't have the training, even though you may be the teacher in the classroom or the principal, if you don't have the training and knowledge and confidence, sometimes you'll let other people lead. As
Mhm.
educators, it's our school, it's our program, it's our students. We need to be the one taking the lead. So the school that I'm speaking about, elementary school in Waterbury, there was that first year, especially, I had principals were going through a training that they would be out of the building for a day. So I committed to being the substitute principal for the day.
Mhm.
So I had the ability to kind of visit, to observe, but also to observe, work with the students. And there was one student in particular who was having a challenging day. And I was the person with the teacher and a paraprofessional who stood in and helped the student to de-escalate. And I was told afterwards that that circumstance, they would have probably moved to a restraint. And that was a case where we did not have to. there was a lot of challenges, a lot of emotion for that student,
Right.
but we were able to use those skills that we've learned to help de-escalate that particular child, and end in a situation where that child was back in the classroom, and restraint was not needed.
Right.
So
Right.
it takes patience, it takes some time, it takes some understanding and need of this, and need of what is useful in that particular situation. But I think that sense of patience and concern has come down a little bit since I entered the school district.
That's great. So I'm going to ask you now the opposite question. Sometimes we hear when the topic of eliminating prone restraint or the topic of eliminating seclusion come up. Sometimes we hear all the terrible things that are going to happen as a result of getting rid of these things. Now, I happen not to generally believe that that's true, but I'm going to ask you the question anyway. What terrible things happened when you got rid of seclusion and prone restraint?
Nothing.
Okay. We hadn't talked about that question, but I'm glad the answer went the way I was hoping it would go. But yeah, that's great. I mean, you had no ill effects. You've had no increases in other things that are concerning, or other incidental side effects from doing this.
No, and I would say too, though, that our problems did disappear.
Right.
The challenges and the complexities that students are coming into school with have not gone away.
Right.
What it's required us to do is to think differently. Sometimes we've been successful, sometimes we have not. It has forced in a good way to look at what resources we do need to properly serve students. And I think that's also an important part of this journey that we're on.
In the resource vein, you set the stage for kind of talking about, being a smaller district without as many resources. And honestly, what's interesting to me is if you look at these issues, restraint and seclusion, for example, we often find it's smaller districts that are really struggling with these things. And that's often what you hear. It's, well, we don't have the resources. We don't have the resources of this district over here. So, we can't necessarily entertain the idea of prohibiting this or, changing our policy here. Any advice that you would have for, other small districts that may not have the resources in terms of the journey that you've had? Anything you might share with them to, help kind of in thinking about that resource issue?
What I found is that there are people who want to help. So there's a superintendent, principals have networks in their region, in the state. And I think if you look and are creative in the solutions, that you will find people who will contribute, whether it's financially, we haven't had that need, but their own expertise. For example, when this came to light in our community, there was a person who is a psychologist by training who has private practice who reached out and said, "Hey, I'd like to have a conversation. This is something that I think this is work that your school is doing that's important. We need to do things differently. Let's sit down and have a conversation, and I'm willing to help as a resource or just a informal consultant." So I think being honest about where you are, trying not to be defensive about what you've experienced, and looking in ways to move forward that build on those community resources. I think you find that there's a lot of people out there who want to do the right thing and want to help where they can.
Yeah. No, I hear you. Organizationally, that's one of our hopes as well. As we talked about earlier, we've worked with you, but we've worked with other leadership teams and schools across the country. And we've reached out, we've sent letters, we've done other things to try to offer support. And, certainly there have been some really positive examples of that. And I always think about you when I think about this, because I felt like we had a really positive relationship. We talked about quite a bit of this is you were, looking at policy changes and other things, and always very receptive. But there are others that are just not. They probably see Alliance Against Seclusion Restraint. They don't take the few minutes that you took to go do some due diligence and figure out who we were. And I'm just kind of curious. I mean, we're always reaching out and we always want to help. Would you have any advice for a superintendent that got a letter from the Alliance or that maybe hasn't but is interested in reaching out? Any advice for that?
The advice is just to be honest and say this is where we are right now,
Yeah,
and this is where I see that we need to go. And can you brainstorm some ways to get there? And that's what you and I did. We talked about some things. I think at points we didn't always necessarily agree on the immediate next step, but we always agreed on where we should be 5 steps from there, and then we could find a way to get there.
Yeah,
and I think that's true in this case or any case involving education or any. You pick the area. It's
Right.
how you do it.
Right.
Your idea isn't necessarily the best idea.
Right.
You being me.
Right.
Where you get the best idea is talking to 1, 2, 3, 4 people, problem solving, and then coming up with a solution. And it can't be about you individually. It has to be about what's the end goal, what's best for kids, and how can we get there in a way that works within the constraints we have, whatever that system is.
Right. Well, and in fact, I remember you and I talking about the idea of sunsetting because our district, our local district, which is where my journey began, that was one of the things that we ended up doing. We put into effect the policy that would sunset seclusion. And while, in all honesty, at the moment we put that policy in effect, I would have far preferred the policy to end it at that moment in time. But I think as an option, it was a good option and one that got us moving in the right direction. So I think by having those conversations, listening to other ideas, listening to perspectives for things that might be happening elsewhere, sometimes those ideas come and it can lead to a solution. And, I think it's important.
In that case, with the administrative procedure that we put together required that if there was a request for seclusion, that it had to come with medical documentation and it had to be approved by the superintendent. So we put some checks in place that and we just didn't have that need. But it was some people, again, it was some people who were concerned, who had honest fears, but fears that many of us believe probably would not need to move to that extreme kind of intervention.
Yeah. So talk to me about at the state level. So you have Rule 4500, which to date still allows prone restraint and seclusion. You, of course, have put a policy in effect that, does not. I know that you've had some involvement at the state level as well. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and, what your hopes might be in terms of seeing changes happen at the state level as well?
In the meantime, between restraint seclusion and today, the initial concerns, Vermont has gone through a huge concern with funding. It's a part of the commission I'm on right now of how we fund our schools. Property taxes went up pretty considerably last year. We're a smaller state that's residential and tourist based. We don't have a huge commercial industrial tax base. So that issue has kind of supplanted other more pressing educational issues, in my opinion, but at the same time, it's still on the table. I would say that the biggest disagreement is from some educators who've seen that we can do things differently versus people who work in the outside mental health realm. I think just the fact that you have agencies using one form of intervention versus another kind of tells you that there's philosophical differences. So I think we've had some conversations to try to move closer together in those areas. And as I said, our local state representative is also the chair of the House Human Services Committee. So I think she has some ideas of how to move through, again, rather than going to the immediate ban of seclusion, prone, supine, restraint, of how to get there in a stepped process. And we're in conversations with how we could make some headway in that area. So it's actually a lesson you taught me earlier on. Sometimes when you can't take that huge step, some smaller baby steps may eventually get you there, because people realize that you can make change without the horror stories that I think people dream up of what will happen.
Right, right, right. And it is frustrating sometimes because you want it to come sooner. You know that it can come sooner. The legislative process was nothing I had any experience with until these, this came into my life, and I began working at the local level, state level, the federal level. And I've got my own impatience with how long it takes to get those
Yes.
things moving. But at the same time, I'd rather see some progress than no progress. And sometimes legislative change is incremental. Rather than continuing to push for the same thing over and over again, and not be able to move forward, sometimes taking a step can be a step in the right direction. And these things can impact lives. So I mean, when you're able to make a change at, I always say, people will say, well, what about changing it at this level or that level? Change it at any level you can. If you can change it in a classroom, change it in that classroom. You can change it in a school, change it in that school. You can change it in a district. And I think about the number of children, families, and educators that are in a better position because of those changes. Wherever you're able to hold that influence, I think it's so important to do that. We're getting near the end of our time here. This goes by quickly, but I want to give a chance here because I've been monopolizing all your time. If anybody here that's watching live has any questions or comments, feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll try to get to a couple of them before we wrap up here if there are any questions that come in. But I have just kind of a couple more things I wanted to talk to you about as we kind of wrap up here. One, I'm going to go back to kind of this idea of, superintendent to superintendent. So, I've not walked in your shoes. I told you before, I actually have a bit of a lot of respect. And, I look at a job like a superintendent job and think, ooh, that looks like, because you get it from all angles sometimes, in terms of, trying to run a school, do the best thing. And everybody has their unique concerns. But as a superintendent, speaking to other, school leaders and superintendents out there, this is an issue again that I think is very important, but sometimes it's not even on somebody's radar, or well, they know that these things happen, but it's gotta kind of the way it's got to be, right? Do you have any advice for somebody out there that might be kind of in your shoes, and maybe they have some issues with restraint and seclusion happening in their district? What advice might you offer to somebody that is kind of walking in the journey that you're in?
I would just say, in and I think I mentioned it in some way, when you're a superintendent, you have a network of people who are in the same shoes that you're in. So I think we all have people that we trust, that we know have expertise in certain areas. And I would say, if you're a superintendent, reach out to someone that you trust, who's also a superintendent, and talk through that process. I've been fortunate, just because of the experience we've had here, to have a couple of people reach out to us. We've had some conversations of how to make changes in your school, in your particular context. So I think that's an important piece of it. And I also think it's important too that when you're dealing with those challenges, if it is something that's very public, like ours was, is to acknowledge that we want to do better. And I think that's also an important part of that process, professionally and personally. That I think when people see that you're open and honest, that they're more willing to extend some grace to make those changes happen, and give that support in the process.
I always think about you as a really good example of that idea. What I'll tell you is, having had the opportunity to, in some way, work across the country with various situations and schools and districts. There are, your approach to that, I think, is really important. And what I'll say is that there are a lot of places where, when these things become issues, you kind of see the wagon circling and going into protective mode, and not acknowledging kind of the issue, or the desire to do something better and different. And that can be a really difficult place for, for leaders and superintendents to be in. And I think, that's something that those that are advocating for change. And it's funny because I think you probably know this, but in the work that we do, we've got a lot of people in our community. We've got a lot of parents and caregivers, but we have a lot of teachers, administrators, related professionals. We've got a really broad community because our ideas here are like, how do we do better for everybody, right? How can we come together and do better? That's not isn't just about being critical and saying you're doing all these things wrong, but still there can be resistance. But we always believe that even if a family comes to us and they're having an issue, like, we start out with, can we collaborate? Can we work together? Can we offer some ideas here? Can we bring in, can we make some suggestions? But again, not not everyone is open to that. And I think that especially if you've got families or others that and again, they may have been through things that are very difficult. They may be very upset, but if you can clear the table for collaborating, there's such better outcomes that can come from it. And rather than, I mean, let's face it, when things escalate, then okay, well, now we have complaints that are filed, or federal complaints, or attorneys, or other things. I think that importance of really just trying for all parties to collaborate out of the box is so important.
Well, and I also think too, and I've just learned this from examples. I've been involved in all those kinds of circumstances. I've been in 2 school districts where we've had complaints filed for various things. We've been in situations where we've had students with IEPs who parents bring in an advocate, and I think that's a good thing. I think sometimes you need a third party. A lot of times what I found, and I've been a superintendent for 16 years now, a lot of times I found that when an issue gets to me, things are pretty difficult, and you really are trying to manage that process to bring resolution in a way that you can come up with a win-win in the end. It may not be everything you want or we're envisioning. It may not be everything the parent wants, but having someone coming in with that outside perspective, neutral perspective, who isn't involved, I found is helpful. And I found that with working with parents as a principal, that sometimes you see your child in one way. And I also have, by the way, a child who's neurodiverse. You see your child in one way, and you see the solution in one way. And when you're bringing in a third party, sometimes they've had experiences that teach them that there's other ways to get to that same resolution. And I think parents in many cases are open if it's someone who they perceive as on their side, saying, look, what the school's telling you in that case is correct. Why don't we look at it in this way and try to resolve the situation in this perspective?
Yeah.
I found that we got to that solution faster when somebody from the outside's involved, whether it's an advocate or an attorney.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and this is a discussion for a whole nother day, but I wish we could re-engineer some of the IEP process, because I think, unfortunately, it sometimes sets up somewhat of an adversarial process, and it shouldn't be. I mean, we should all really be around the table for the same purpose. But unfortunately, I think the process sometimes itself makes it a little bit more, kind of adversarial. And at the end of the day, when we're all able to kind of come together, work together, know that we're there to ultimately support a child and improve outcomes. But it's hard. I mean, I've been through that myself, and been with many families that have gone through that as well, and had some really positive experiences. I remember in fact, my son, for the last 4 years, we were in a non-public, but we still had the IEP process. And after many years of some really difficult meetings, we had this team that we were just all so aligned that the meetings were like pleasant, and they were, we would problem solve and work together. But it's a challenge, and I think realizing the humanity in everyone, I think, is important. And again, I mean, nobody's becoming a teacher to restrain and seclude. Nobody wants to not see your child be successful, but at the same time, there's all these different things out in the universe that may be affecting, what's happening. Giving ourselves grace, giving each other grace, that's always worth doing.
Yeah, and I found the same thing I talked about from the parent perspective, but from the school perspective, I've changed my mind on the way we've approached situations and educational programming based on what I've learned through the process and just being open to listen.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, I think on that note, we will wrap up because I promised you that I would have you out of here by 4:45, and we are just about there. So
Perfect.
we will go ahead and wrap up. But I really appreciate you joining me for this time. And our hope here when we do these is, we get a number of people that watch these live, and we always encourage people to share these. I think that this is a really important one for leadership and for people that might find themselves in a situation where they're going through some of these things. And I really appreciate your, your collaboration, because I really do value, the collaboration we had as you were going through this process. And, I appreciate the changes that you've helped to bring about for your district and really make it a positive difference. So I want to thank you for being here today. Do you have any final word you want to leave us with as we end today?
No, I appreciate everyone who is watching and who's passionate about this topic because it's important, especially with some of the challenges we're facing moving forward with resources for schools. I think
Absolutely.
we need to stay more in tune to this now than ever.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. On that note, we are going to let everybody go. I'm going to ask you to stick around for 1 minute, and then I will let you go as well. But I want to thank everybody for being here today, and we will see you again next time. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.